please join me in welcoming to the stage Professor Emeritus David Lewin.
Thank you, Dean Rankin, and good evening. Before I get started, I've been asked by several of you, how long have I been in Melbourne, and have I been here before? I have been here before, but this time, tomorrow will be my 11th day. And yesterday I was at the Point Leo estate, where we had the 6 for 6, $6 for tasting 6 wines. I'd never experienced anything like that in my life. But I wouldn't mind if, when it comes to being dead and buried, I wouldn't mind being buried in the sculpture garden. That was a place that caught my attention. I did do the Yarra Valley wine tour for a day, did do Sovereign Hill, and went into the mine and came out of the mine, which I consider to be an accomplishment. And of course, the parallels between California and Melbourne in particular in the gold rush experience in the middle of the 19th century are well known. Did a city tour the day after I arrived here from Seoul, Korea, where the temperatures were about 40 to 41 Celsius, so I welcomed the weather here. Went to Bird's Basement and heard a great 5-piece jazz group. Went to the Melbourne Museum and the Immigration Museum and squeezed a few other things in between. So this time, my trip to Melbourne, I got to be exposed to some things that last time I wasn't and knew little about. Well, of course, I'm highly honored to have been invited to deliver the Prescott Lecture here in Melbourne. I think I was asked about this either last December or early January, and I said yes right away. I'm also in this capacity here visiting the Department of Management as well as the Australian Consortium for Research in Employment and Work at Monash University, the co-director being Professor Bamber that Dean Rankin mentioned previously. My topic tonight is, as you've heard, leadership and management, an integrated approach. And I want to try to lay out the approach, bounce it off of you. I have one slide only that I'm going to use or attempt to use for this presentation. And I think maybe I should begin by saying that this is an approach that I developed after decades of teaching business school students, executives, serving in some leadership positions in 2 major universities, Columbia University and UCLA, consulting with private, public, and non-governmental and nonprofit organizations, and serving on boards of directors. And this experience, it's this collective experience, not any one component of it in particular, has shaped my view about leadership and management, an integrated approach, a view that I want to share with you briefly this evening. The approach is also based on the substantial rise in product market, capital market, and labor market competition that has proceeded worldwide, especially since the breakup of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall, 1989, 1990 we're talking, and perhaps even before that, the triple revolution that started in the early 1980s of a more rapid technological change, deregulation in many parts of the world, and of course, substantially enhanced global competition. And the reason I cite these factors is because I believe they have contributed to an overly narrow way of conceiving of organizations, not just business organizations, and of business school curriculums. My approach features an input-output framework, an input transformation output framework that basically positions an organization on its side horizontally. And I'll elaborate it briefly in a moment. The approach is meant as a contrast to the vertical organization and structure of most companies, most nonprofit organizations, public agencies, and business school curricula. And these specialized areas, which one might think of as silos, the word silo has been converted into the verb siloed. They are narrow vertical structures composed of specialties. So, as examples, every organization has an accounting department, and every business school curriculum, undergraduate and graduate, has an accounting course. Each one, a business organization and a business school curriculum, has a finance course, an operations management course, a human resource management or equivalent course, a strategy course, and so on. And there is a long-standing rationale for having these particular areas of knowledge and functions in organizations because they're thought to be germane to operating a business enterprise or a not-for-profit enterprise. And they are germane. But what's happened is that they have become even more specialized, each one compared to the other. This is true in marketing, it is true in finance, it is true in operations management, it's true across the board. And this has been accentuated by the development of so-called big data or data analytics. I was saying to some of you outside, I think including Mr. Prescott, when I hear the phrase big data, it makes me wonder, what are small data? It's like the phrase best practices. It's one of the most meaningless phrases you could ever cite unless you can tell somebody what an average practice is or what a poor practice is. So big data and data analytics are the rage today, and what they have resulted in part, is deeper knowledge in each of the specialty areas and the experts in them, the people who do marketing in companies or who teach marketing in business schools, the people who do finance in companies and teach finance in business schools, and so on with the other specialties, have developed much deeper knowledge than their predecessors, in part using big data or data analytics. So what's wrong with this? What I believe is wrong with it is that these areas are increasingly isolated from each other. You go deeper and deeper into a specialized area and tend to ignore, and increasingly ignore, what else is there, either in a business enterprise or in a business school curriculum. So my view is that we should step back and think about an organization in a horizontal frame rather than in a vertical frame. And that horizontal frame basically is this input, transformation, output approach. Every organization, it doesn't matter where they are based in the world, it doesn't matter how old or young they are, it doesn't matter what products or services they generate, it doesn't matter how big or small they are, have four fundamental inputs. One of those is revenue. For companies, it's typically from customers or clients. This is sales revenue. For governments, it's revenue generated from taxes and in some places user fees. For nonprofit organizations, NGOs, at least in some countries, it's heavily revenue dependent upon donors or patrons. Revenue is an input for every organization. That's input number one. Input number two are financial resources, the capital to seed a business, to grow a business, or any other kind of entity, and determining the sources of that capital, determining debt versus equity ratios, determining the deployment of financial assets. This is financial resources as a second input to all organizations. A third one is human resources, the people who do the work or perform the services. Input number three, no matter what type of work that is or at what level we're talking about in an organization, that's human resources. And the fourth input is something I refer to as operating systems and processes, typically suffused with technology, lots of it in the modern era. So we have four inputs, and they look like this. And every organization takes these inputs and attempts to do something to or with them. This is the transformation. They process the inputs, doing things to and with them in order to convert them into outputs. Now, generically, the outputs take the form of goods and services, and in any number of organizations, both goods and services. But this transformation of inputs into outputs is constrained, is done within the parameters established by business goals or objectives, presumably coming out of a strategic planning process. And so for some companies, their main objective may be increasing sales revenue by a very specified amount. Retail companies tend to focus on that sort of metric. For other companies, manufacturing energy companies, it tends to be return on invested capital or return on capital employed. For still other companies, it's market share. And for some companies, it's all of these parameters or objectives that they have in mind, and you can read them in the strategic plan. And for an increasing number of companies, if you read their annual reports, though this is generally not required to be reported by governmental regulatory authorities, customer satisfaction is another major objective. And for public organizations, revenue growth is often an objective. Meeting budget is often an objective. This one slide captures this input, transformation, output within strategic objectives approach. And most people working in organizations and most people enrolled in business school programs, undergraduate and graduate alike, they are specialists in one or another of these areas. They may not be experts, although some are. So at a place like Monash Business School, you have experts who teach marketing, customers and customer relationship management, and brand equity. That's their mantra. They know that part of the business extremely well, that silo. You have others who teach finance and know portfolio theory and the specific decisions around risk and diversification. You have others whose specialty is in human resources and organizational behavior, the motivation of people at work. You have others who are specialists in operations management and management science, where optimization is their mantra, total quality improvement, Six Sigma, those kinds of ideas. Strategy has its own set of experts too, both in the formulation of strategy, ending with positioning a company and identifying the strategic objectives, and especially in strategy execution. And in the lower portion of this single slide, you see a few other areas mentioned as well, disciplines they're sometimes referred to. They're represented in business school curricula around the world. That's courses in economics, statistics, accounting, and behavioral science, which are there not to produce experts in those areas, but to get those aspiring managers and leaders to understand that statistics and accounting and economics and behavioral science are tools that can help one convert the inputs into the outputs, to transform those inputs into outputs. Now, if most people are working in a specialized component area of the type represented on this slide, then who is it that might see the larger picture, that might not be siloed into one of the specialties, that might have a more holistic view of organizations? My argument is that that ought to be leaders and managers. In other words, if you're going to be a manager or a leader, especially of the future, not of the past, you're going to have to develop a threshold level of knowledge and capability about customers so that you can make informed decisions about customer retention and pricing and determining which customers we may want to divest because their cost exceeds their value. You have to have a threshold level of knowledge and capability in finance, the management of financial assets, and not be a captive of your finance staff and subcontract the decisions to them. You have to have, especially these days when words like talent are all the rage around the world, a level of competency and knowledge and experience in managing people that puts you in the position to undertake and execute at a high level a leadership position and a management position. And the same thing is true if you come from the area of operations management, and especially if you don't. If you come from one of the other areas, you need to develop a threshold level of capability and knowledge in operations management. And then, of course, in strategy per se. In other words, one has to outgrow their safe specialty silo, that area and body of knowledge that we have where we typically enter into a specific job in a specific function. Very few people around the world, and there are several people in this room who know a great deal about leadership and would know, very few people are hired for their leadership potential. It's hard to gauge and hard to measure, and usually most hiring processes have an immediate demand for specific work to get done that guides the hiring process. But at some point, people lead and manage organizations. And if they continue to have a siloed approach, they are basically risking the underperformance of their organizations. Now, it's been a tradition for many decades for companies in specific sectors or industries to promote to senior positions, to the C-suite, as it is sometimes referred to, people who come from the specialty area that that company and industry is known for. So, for example, consumer products companies, Procter & Gamble is a good example, there are many others, typically the top 50 or 100 or 200 executives in that company all somehow came through sales and marketing. None of them came through operations, none of them came through finance, none of them came through IT. In aerospace companies and in the modern high-tech company, that's a good time to have dropped the clicker because I'm done with the slide. That's what that bang was, in case you were curious, and I was curious. In aerospace companies and in the more contemporary high-tech companies, the top 50 or 100 or 200 people somehow always seem to come through engineering. They don't come through sales and marketing. They don't come through IT. They don't come through operations management. And in manufacturing companies all around the world, the tradition has been that the people who rise to the top there have come through operations. And what I'm suggesting is that that's the wave of the past. It's not the wave of the future. Because in future, we have to develop managers and leaders who have threshold knowledge and capability, and hopefully experience, in the main component areas, both in companies and in business school curriculum, that will allow them to achieve greatness in leadership and management positions. There are some companies that I think have demonstrated, at least to some extent, the integrated approach that I'm referring to here. And a few of them would include A.P. Moller Maersk, which I believe is still the largest shipping company in the world, Westfield, which we have some considerable experience with in the cities that I know best in the United States, namely Los Angeles and New York, Adobe Systems Incorporated, FedEx, Johnson & Johnson, Unilever. Those companies would be on my list of companies that have, at least in part, attempted to use this integrated approach to leadership and management. Now, Japanese companies were thought to have used this approach, or at least attempted it. And I think that they did. If you look at the leadership and management literature of the 1980s, there was a book that Ezra Vogel wrote about this called Japan is Number One. And Japanese management for a time was all the rage in other countries, and books were written about it, and people looked to the Japanese company as a model for others, particularly around total quality management. But the Japanese companies, if they did take the integrated approach, and I say if advisedly because it's still an open question, seem to do that less so today. And I'm not sure if that has something to do with the slide in the Japanese economy over a couple of decades or simply some other changes. I'm doing some work right now with Nissan, Renault, Mitsubishi, known as the Alliance. That's the largest auto producer in the world right now, going by the end of year 2017 figures. And they have a very siloed approach, the classical siloed approach. So Nissan had been known for a more integrated approach, Mitsubishi to some degree, Renault less so, but they seem to be in the silo frame of mind these days as opposed to the integrated approach. And so I think that's an interesting circular example in a way, going from one practice to the other. The main benefit of an integrated approach to leadership and management, in my opinion, is enhanced organizational performance. And a companion benefit is developing a strong bench, a strong inventory of successors to leadership and management positions. I understand that in Australia, I was just discussing this with some of you in the corridor, the average tenure of members of C-suites, the C-suite is a shorthand phrase for CEO or managing director, chief operating officer or president, and major executives in other functions such as marketing and finance and so forth. These days, everybody seems to be a chief, you'll have noticed, less so a vice president or a director. But the average tenure of people holding those positions in U.S. companies and in European companies has declined significantly in the statistical sense of the term. So, for example, the most recent studies of CEO tenure, United States-based and managing director, European-based, show average tenure of a little over 3 years. If you go back to the year 1990, a little more than a quarter century ago, the average tenure was in double digits, 10.2 years. The average tenure of CFOs is even shorter than that of CEOs or managing directors. It's about 2.5 years. And marketing, which has relatively recently come to adopt the word chief in the title, CMO, Chief Marketing Officer, in place of vice president or director, one recent study shows that their average tenure is of some 17 months, compared to the average tenure of over 3 years for heads of marketing with vice president and director titles. And it appears, according to the authors of the marketing study, that companies go after, attempt to poach is one phrase, chiefs of marketing because they think they know something that vice presidents of marketing and directors of marketing do not know. And actually, if you go back into the history of management titles, there were no chiefs until pretty much after World War II. If you want to read a good book about this, Alfred Sloan, who was president, not CEO, of General Motors for many years and wrote a book called My Years at General Motors, he actually wrote the book as opposed to having a ghostwriter or an agent write it. He wrote the book. Then you had presidents, and you had maybe vice presidents of functions. And later on, it was only later on that heads of companies became CEOs and heads of finance became chief financial officers. And today we have chiefs of everything: marketing, human resources, chief human resource officers, chief information technology officers. There is one other study that shows that chiefs relative to VPs and directors of the same function have significantly higher remuneration, because the word chief is in their title. So we have lots of chiefs. I don't know if this implies that we have lots of Indians out there and that employees are going to be renamed by that title. I hope that they are not. And as a by the way, you will have noticed that there's an increasing tendency to not refer to employees as employees. Ring up a call center. An employee won't be with you in 4 minutes if you get past the automated system. An associate will be with you. A representative will be with you. If you deal with Disney, it's a cast member. That is literally true. It doesn't matter what position you hold. This kind of attempt to mask the fact that there's an employment relationship there is endemic. And perhaps the biggest example of this is the one most in the news right now in many countries, and it's the use of independent contractors versus employees. And if you can get work done by an independent contractor, you don't pay payroll taxes. That's one advantage over having that same work done by an employee. Or, for the latest example that we like to emphasize, you still have to pay independent contractors to get work done. But there are some people that companies and educational institutions to boot don't pay at all for the labor services they render. And that's you and me as customers. So if you buy your airline ticket online and download your boarding pass, somebody used to be paid to do that. If you check in and out of your hotel, somebody used to be paid to do that. If you track your package in DHL or FedEx or one of the other services, somebody used to be paid to do that. This is all about the competition for keeping labor costs down in markets. And inherently, there's nothing wrong with trying to compete on labor costs. But again, that is only one component of the business, and we have been through this many times in the U.S., especially in responses to recession and more recently the Great Depression. Companies cut labor costs because they want to try to increase the margin between revenue and cost and report a positive profitability. But cutting labor costs is not a strategy. It's a tactic typically for the short term. So in the framework that I'm offering here, it's important to notice what business schools do not have as well as what they do have. They all have these specialized vertical courses of the type I described before. But what they don't have is a course that attempts to integrate across these functions and put them together. And businesses don't have anything like that either. They occasionally venture into it by sending a few people to executive programs where this kind of idea is broached. But in both instances, the student and the manager, the responsibility falls on them to try to integrate across these specialties. And that's a very tall order. Isn't it time, approaching 2020, for business schools to think about turning the specialties on their side and providing a deep immersion in integration, the horizontal aspect of managing and leading, especially if you hope to produce managers and leaders, not just technical analysts or good consultants? Isn't it time that business enterprises and NGOs and public agencies make a move in this same direction, because the low and not so low hanging fruit can be, in my opinion, enhanced organizational performance. And it can be the transformation of organizations, and it can be the development of this deep bench that I'm talking about, of people who are capable of moving up to management and leadership positions. I noticed in the opening slide that was up here that advertises Monash and the Prescott lecture, there were 3 organizations listed below that are certification organizations for business school curricula. The one that I'm the most familiar with is the American Association of Collegiate Schools of Business. What these entities do in countries like yours and mine is to determine whether business school curricula meet these organizations' certification requirements. Are they legitimate in the eyes of these certifying organizations? They are legitimate if they have a course in accounting, a course in marketing, a course in finance, a course in either human resources or organizational behavior, a course in operations, a course in strategy, a course in economics, a course in statistics. If they lack one of those courses, they won't be certified. And these areas of specialization are what drive not only the curriculums of these schools, but the faculty who are hired. This is true all around the world. What they don't require for certification is an integrating course of the type that I'm advocating in my approach to leadership and management. Nothing that puts these things together. So there is a challenge out there, not just to business schools on their own and not just to companies and nonprofit organizations and public agencies, but to the certification organizations. They need to take a step backwards and stop going down that path that they carved out so long ago, on which they are increasingly dependent, that is known as path dependence in the research world, and step back and ask, isn't it time that we think differently, at least somewhat differently, about these curriculums that we are in the business of attempting to certify? So in sum, I believe that the wave of the future is different from the wave of the past. I offer my leadership and management integration perspective as an idea for you to consider, but also for something more than idea, for a call to action to get us away from where we are being driven increasingly by big data, and to think about organizations in a more holistic, integrated, horizontal fashion.